Hi everybody, welcome to this talk. I'm Tim Laptino, author of Art of Atari, and it is my privilege to talk with Alex Rubens, who is the author of 8-Bit Apocalypse. This is the untold story of Atari's Missile Command. So we're going to talk about the process of making the book and a bit about the game. And really, Alex, I just want you to talk about yourself. So this is it's all about you. It's the Alex show.
Sure. Yeah.
So why write a book about Missile Command?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually didn't have a huge affinity for the game before writing the book. I played it, obviously, back at my arcade growing up, but wasn't live when the game came out, so obviously didn't enjoy it too much then. But in 2012, when Dave Torre, the creator of the game, got a Pioneer Award at GDC, the Game Developers Conference, just thought it was super interesting that someone so impactful to the game development community, no one really knew his story. And someone told me that they'd heard rumblings that, stuff had been out before about how he was a little bit haunted by the games. And so it just bugged him so much that he finally let me tell it. So in 2013, I wrote a piece for Polygon.com, sort of about that exact aspect of Dave's story. And then after that happened, so many people started reaching out with more and more stories related to Missile Command that thought it would be cool to get them all together to tell.
Right, and I've read the book, and it's great, and I love that you dug into it. My question is, tell people a little bit about your background. Like, how do you even come to games? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was a video game journalist for like 7 years, I think. Now I work at YouTube, so I help people who make videos about gaming on YouTube.
So if you want to get your analytics stuff, this is the guy. Come talk to him.
I'm the one who features it on the front. No, I don't do that. I'm just kidding. But before that I was a video game journalist, so did a ton of writing for IGN, G4, Polygon, all the gaming magazines that are now defunct, unfortunately. And so that was sort of the original reason that I explored the story.
Right, so you hear Dave's story, and you're like, it kind of, you've written a lot about video games, and now you're interested in the story. What did you do next?
Yeah, it was interesting. Even getting a hold of Dave was extremely difficult. He made like 3 games, and then, or I guess like 4, and then got out of games completely and didn't really associate with a ton of people who were left in the industry. So he went on to do other computer programming and didn't really want to talk about it at all. It was like a pretty intense, to say the least, experience for him. So somehow tracked him down through the Game Developers Conference. He'd been involved with that, accepting his awards, so it made it a little bit easier that he had just sort of been refreshed. Finally figured out his email, got a hold of him, and he said no, and didn't want to do it. Said, I don't do interviews, thanks. And it was like very short and sweet to the...
So you're writing a book about Missile Command, and the guy chiefly responsible for it doesn't want to talk to you.
Yeah,
what
exactly.
were you thinking when that happened?
Well, I was like, oh, this sucks. I'd already done so much research and wanted to tell it so badly, right? And I think for me that actually made it even more appealing to want to tell it, right? It's like, why doesn't he want to tell it? Obviously, this is why it's never been told to anyone else, right?
So he knew you were writing a book, and that didn't get his motor running at all.
Well, it was actually interesting. That was for the original article. So I went and talked to all the other people that he had worked with at the time, the people who had ported it for the Atari 2600, and then essentially said, well, they talked to me and they told me some really interesting stuff about you, and then he was willing to sort of, then he was interested, right? He's like, what'd they say? And so you kind of baited him in that way. And then once I think we started talking and he realized it was I respect the thing that you've done so much and want to tell that story to people, not hey, look at this crazy guy who had nightmares because of games. He was a lot more willing to do it. And so it was super exciting. We were able to talk a lot. He was able to show me some stuff that I think people hadn't really seen before. So, I talk about it in the book, but Missile Command originally had a much bigger marquee that actually would light up and interact with the game. But they found it too distracting, and I don't know that had been seen too much before. And he said, oh, it's in my garage, I'll go take a picture, and just sent it to me. And so that was pretty crazy. I wanted to put it in the book, but wasn't able to for licensing reasons.
Yes, which we will not talk about. So, you were able to, spoiler, obviously at the end of this, go buy the book, everybody, so you can read the story. but why, why was this so hard for him? There's how many people in this room are developers? How many people are video game developers? Look, they're all here. They're talking about what they do. They're probably all reasonably well-adjusted people, right? Give or take. Not that guy. Not that guy. Not. Okay. But what was it about Dave that it was just really hard, and this is a difficult, almost painful process?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's just a really intense person, right? So he put so much of himself into the game that he had nightmares every single night for months, and even months after the game came out, occasionally still having them pretty far after the game came out. And so I think for him it was just such a highly intensive personal experience where, he told some of the people that he was working with at the time, but he didn't really get into it. He'd be like, oh, I had a dream about the game last night. And didn't really say, how big it actually was. Like, he just every night see himself walking in the mountains and see missiles streak in, which is pretty wild. So I think for him, what he said is he didn't want to seem like a crazy person. He has kids, he has a family, he has people who don't really know anything about this and wouldn't want his daughters to see people calling his dad crazy, which is cool because that's not at all what happened. Like, everyone was like, oh wow, that's such an intensely impactful and powerful thing. I'm glad that he went through that to be able to, not glad that he went through it, but I'm glad that he powered through enough to make the game for people and felt so intensely compelled to do so that he finished it.
Totally, and it makes it more meaningful. And I think you have to look at this from the cultural side of it. This is, for me, growing up, at the tail end of the Cold War. I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. But the idea that we were at war. There's Russia and they have all these nukes, and I mean, it was everywhere. It was in the air that you breathe, and I think even more so, when Dave was making this game. And I think there's almost a sense where, okay, yeah, this is a really simple game. There's the graphics are what you think of for early '80s arcade. It's not super immersive, but because of the time and Dave almost sort of brewed some of that into this game. It was, people say, pluck from the headlines, and it really feels like that, but not in an exploitative way, because he was really trying to say something.
Yeah.
What do you feel like? What was he trying to? I mean, that sort of game is a limited communications vehicle. There's only so many things you can really say. What do you think, Dave? What was he trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, in general, he designed the entire game around trying to tell people that nuclear war is not the option, right? You never attack anyone in Missile Command. It's always purely defensive, which is super interesting. You can't beat the game. You can't win at nuclear war, right? You just eventually die. It's the end. That was always sort of his motto around that stuff, right? That's why the cities aren't named, right? He wanted you to feel some personal attachment to it that felt a lot more real to you.
Right, so you're defending your city. Right, they were originally cities here cities in California.
Yeah, I think they said they were so self-absorbed that they made it the cities that they were in and the cities around them, and then realized eventually that they should let everyone do that themselves.
Some of us in Chicago would be like, oh, California falls off the map.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, totally. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's really interesting. Let's back up a little bit. Talk about, you talk about his story, but obviously he's not working alone. What did you learn about Atari and the creative environment there?
Yeah, Atari was super interesting. I talked to Nolan Bushnell, Al Alcorn, some of Dave's coworkers like Rob Fulop and Rich Adam, and it was super interesting to learn. I think the most revealing part of talking to them about the culture at the time is to see talking to a lot of them now versus what they said back then. Some people maybe want to make Atari seem like it was a little cleaner than it was eventually. Nolan says we definitely didn't do drugs at work. That was a thing he told me a couple months ago. So that was really funny. And counter to everything he said in the past. But it was just really interesting to see that you could 100% tell why in that environment how someone could get so deeply into a game that they were making, right? They would hang out and have fun, and they'd play so many games, right? Dave often said that when he was making Missile Command, there'd just be a line of people trying to play the game in his office, right? Yeah. So it was really easy to see how someone could work such long hours trying to get it done in time in the short development span that they had. And so that was all really interesting to me. And to see that even now, in the last couple of weeks, there's been a real big discussion of the crunch in video games and how long of hours people are working, and seeing that someone like Dave would even work 96 hours straight, he said at one point, to where his hands stopped working. which was pretty wild. And just that was like sort of the culture. Like everyone wanted to make games and wanted to be at Atari.
Yeah.
So to see that, everyone felt that way, even if they had their different ways of experiencing it, was pretty cool.
Well, and I think that's so interesting because that was organic. They were, they were loving what they were doing. They were part of something amazing. At that point, Atari was the fastest growing company in U.S. history.
Yeah.
But the conversation that's happening now is that's been baked into the industry.
Yeah.
And that's been baked into this instead
People
of it.
don't want to.
Right. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to do that. But I mean, these guys it was like for love of the game in some ways.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting that Atari was sort of the first, but you see how that sort of stuff continued.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that talking to Nolan, he said he was actually really happy to see how Atari basically influenced tech culture in general, right? Like every company now in Silicon Valley is sort of based off of the original design of Atari as a company. And for him, that is like one of his lasting impacts that I think is most important to him. And it was just interesting to see that sort of developed organically there, and now it's like a perk, right? But then that was just Atari.
Right. And some of it comes out of the culture. Nolan has said to me before, he's like, well, I'm just an old hippie. And this idea that there was this blurry line between work and play, and why not have people come and hang out and, come and go as they please, and, we could, have beer Fridays and all that kind of, we have a foosball table and an arcade.
Yeah.
Those weren't perks, they were a natural outgrowth of this idea, but then when you systematize them and you put them, you solidify them into a particular way of doing things, we see the downside of that, right?
Sure.
Like you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It was for them, that was just part of making everyone feel like a family and wanting to come to work, right? He said, beer Fridays were as much of like, let's celebrate with our coworkers as much as if I get people to drink, then they'll stay longer and hang out, and think of Atari as a place that they want to be at all times, right? People would say often sometimes the parking lot on Saturday was just as full, if not more full, than it was during the week, because people just wanted to come to work.
Yeah. Cool. Well, and that's really different, and I think in 2018, I think we can look at that and be like, well, we know that's not so healthy. But I think there's a difference between that and people wanting to come in because they were passionate about what they're doing, versus like literally last week I was talking to somebody who worked somewhere where the higher ups would actually peek out the window at the parking lot and see whose car was there on Saturday. And if you weren't, you were in trouble. So some people would actually park their cars and then get a ride with somebody else. So you're like, oh no, I've been working all weekend. But that's messed up. But that was obviously not their goal. That was totally not their goal. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. Like, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about the making of this game, or even just what it was like to be a developer there?
I mean, in my mind, it was pretty surprising to see that if you wanted to do something, you could really just do it, right? Like, they didn't tell you, I mean, originally how he was told to make the game is like, here's a magazine clipping I saw, make something like this, right? And it was really up to you to figure out exactly how to do that. You obviously had to get it approved at some point. You couldn't just go the entire dev cycle without getting it approved by anyone. But you were really given so much freedom, and I think that was really cool. Even freedom to make changes, like the 2600 version is very different than the arcade version. And so for me, that was just pretty unique, and I think pretty emblematic of the culture at Atari at the time, and why we got so many different, unique games. Right? You didn't have to just do what everyone thought would sell, but if you thought it was a cool idea, or you even just picked it from the book of cool ideas that they had sitting around, you could go make it.
Yeah. Well, it seems like Dave had really strong opinions. I mean, this is obviously conjecture, but because of that environment, do you feel like, if it were 20 years later, as a much more established, you can come work in our IT department as a game designer, do you think he would have made games in another environment?
Maybe, right? Like, I think he was still pretty junior at the time, right? He'd made one game before and done some, small programming before that. But I think at the time, if you wanted to be a programmer, Atari was just kind of the place to do it, right? Like, you could learn, you could do it in a fun medium. The industry was still growing a lot. He still programs now, but it's a lot more boring stuff, right? You can actually see he has a lot of patents out there, which is kind of cool. But I think you look at how much he put into each game that he made, right? Each game that he did, Missile Command, Tempest, iRobot, as big of a flop as it was, very impactful, right? He put so much into himself, I don't know that he could have continued to do that for...
Well, and that leads right into the thing that we were talking about earlier. When I was reading a book, I was just struck by like, okay, this is a game developer, he's a designer, and how serious and almost somber like the game making process was for him. You know, was it, you know, and that's so different than like the fun of actually playing that game. It's really fun because it doesn't feel, I mean, yes, it's about nuclear war and you're being assaulted by, you know, all these missiles bombarding you, but it's still a fun game. But, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, 99% of people would never even really think beyond the gameplay itself, right? So his whole thing was, I want to tell this story, I have this narrative, but I'm going to bake it into the gameplay so that if you feel that connection, then you feel that connection, but I'm not going to force it on you, right? In general, he's a pretty serious guy. Like when you talk to him, it takes a lot to pull stuff in interviews because he's just very logical and short in the way that he does things. But I think he always said, the game has to be fun and pretty above all else, right? That's why the game's so visually striking, why it is fun, and you can never know the story and the narrative that he wanted to get to, and you can still have immense fun with it.
Yeah. Now, originally, when I was in the archives looking at stuff at the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, we were looking through old Missile Command stuff, and one of the things we found was an old marquee drawing, and the game before it was called Missile Command, apparently it was called Apocalypse. Did you learn anything about that while you were doing this research?
Yeah, Armageddon.
Armageddon,
yeah. It was Armageddon, and they thought it was too hard to like spell, and also was kind of disturbing for people. And I was really thankful for it because writing a book all about something called Armageddon, I probably still would not have figured out how to spell it on the first time. Yeah, so it's yeah, they talked about that a lot, and so Missile Command eventually is what it became.
Yeah.
But yeah, great.
Well, and like, you know, talking about like, you know, if you wanted the game to be fun, they also wanted to tell like a snippet of that story. It feels like that's a little more on the nose.
Sure.
Right. Hey, what is this game about? Let me think about that.
Like Missile Command is just a fun thing. You're a guy. You're setting up missiles, right?
It's cool. It's upbeat.
Yeah, Armageddon's like, oh, we're all dead. We all died. There's no happy ending to that.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Right. No, totally. That's awesome. So, you know, I had my own experiences, you know, when we were working on Art of Atari, you know, digging into this era and digging into that culture. What was the, you know, and for me at times it was challenging. It was sort of like detective work, trying to figure out who did this, who did that, like who should I talk to, where are they alive, are they dead, you know, like what was your research process like for like going about this? Was that easy, you know? And then part two of the question is like, you know, what was the writing process like for you?
Yeah, I mean, finding a lot of the people involved in it was definitely really challenging. You talk to someone like Dave and he'd mention Rich, but wouldn't really elaborate on who that was. So you'd have to figure out that was Rich Adam, his junior programmer, and then try and track down someone named Rich Adam, right? Which is like somewhat of a generic name.
So what did you do? Did you Facebook stalk people? What did
Yeah,
you do?
Facebook stalk people, Google them. Luckily, once you could get in contact with one person, it made it a lot easier to say, oh, I still talk to this other guy and can get you in touch with them. But it was definitely challenging and also just really difficult to get people to recall something so specific that happened, you know, 38 years ago, or at least 35 throughout the whole writing process. And so many people had conflicting different memories, right? And I think that was one of the benefits of getting Dave to talk, right? Is, you know, he says one thing, but someone else says another. And so it was really helpful. And even now, being able to sort of call people on maybe their BS sometimes, like Nolan saying no one did drugs. I definitely was not fired from Atari,
right.
Which he has since clarified in the book that he for sure was fired, which is good.
Nolan.
That was all great, right? And so it was really difficult, but good because you could sort of arrange all these puzzle pieces out and sort of ask people to confirm different parts of them, and then you realize what's a really solid portion of the story to tell. And the good thing is, I think most people were so surprised that, you know, anyone really cared, right? They know Missile Command has been in lots of parts of pop culture, but don't really realize how much it means to a lot of people. So even talking to the guy who wrote the Chuck episode, that was an homage to Missile Command, and he was still surprised that people liked the episode as much, right? So all of that was super cool.
That's super cool. It's funny that in 2018, I mean, there's, you know, how many thousands of people are going to go through the doors this weekend here, and someone could say, is anyone interested in that? And it seems to me a no-brainer. I had somebody laugh in my face actually while I was researching, well, not in my face, on the phone. But he laughed when I said, I said, I'm writing a book about, Atari. He's like, and you think people are going to buy this?
Yeah.
Like, hopefully you didn't have that.
No, I mean, that was my thought of the panel. Was, oh no, is anyone going to come? So I'm very, very happy. But another difficulty was actually some people weren't alive anymore, right? So the book's not only about Missile Command, but frames it up around Atari a little bit. And both Ray Kassar and Ted Dabney unfortunately passed away while I was writing it. So that makes it a little hard, and you also want to make sure that you give people a chance to defend themselves when someone says something about you. So that was another difficulty, but it was actually luckily pretty easy to arrange once you had all your information, because it's just such a good story. So it made it really nice to build a narrative around.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So Missile, people say, oh, you're writing a whole book about Missile Command, and there's lots of games. There's a lot of games that are still influential, both in gaming but also in culture. Like, why do you think Missile Command has had something of a lasting impression on people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's just fun, first up, right? And then it's very visually striking. I think you don't see a lot of games that are very visually striking and also fast and still hold up today. Right? Like, there's a lot of games here that are fun to play, but you won't sit there for a couple hours and play it, right? Yeah. Or it might just be you. There's not like a whole mass of people who all want to play them. And so I think it's a game that it holds up, and it's just been so easily portable to everything as time has gone on, right? You can play it in your Tesla now as of last week, right? That
I don't get it.
Not that you should. I've seen a video of it.
Right.
It doesn't look like it works out too well, but you definitely can, right? And I think that's just because the gameplay is so simple, but so fun, and it's always challenging, right? There are games that you play and you say, okay, I'm really good at this. I probably don't need to play it as much anymore, right? You can never be too good at Missile Command because you'll still lose.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's iconic. I think you said,
Yeah.
you talked about in the book how there were a lot of other elements, and the game process was just them stripping them away, until really it was really reductive. But I think that gives it a very visually striking look.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff that they wanted to do that they took out because it just made it too complicated, right? You don't need railroads and trying to protect those. Protecting cities is hard enough. You don't have to worry about material management and resource management. So taking all that out, I think, made it really easy and made it something that anyone can pick up and play and can always sort of live on down the road.
Those are for the German-style Missile Command board game that's coming out next year, right?
Yeah.
So, I want you touch on this a little bit in the book. You talk about one of Dave's other games, which is also up there in the pantheon. Is Tempest. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, having back-to-back hits like that is pretty wild, especially as someone who is as junior as he was, right? I think the cool thing about Missile Command being so successful is that Dave was pretty much allowed to do whatever he wanted after that, right? So he took the time to figure something out, and they eventually asked him to do 3D Space Invaders, try and figure that out, because I don't think at the time anyone had been able to. And so he was trying a few different things out, and sort of in opposite of Missile Command, where the game influenced his nightmares, he actually thought back to nightmares that he used to have in first grade at camp, where he saw a scary movie where monsters came out of the ground. And so Tempest is actually based off of that, right? The monsters are coming out of the ground theoretically, and you're moving around to try and defend yourself. And I thought that was super interesting, right? And that is yet another really iconic game that came from Dave.
Yeah, and nothing looks like, Tempest is totally iconic. Like, you see Tempest, you know what it is. It looks like nothing else.
Yeah, it was a game, again, he had to tone it down a little bit. It was a lot scarier, I think, when they were first doing it. His dreams, from what he was saying, were pretty intense around that, pretty scary monsters coming out of the ground. So it was cool that he, again, made something so iconic and easily playable for everyone, as hard as it was.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. I'm going to go off script for a second. So, writing this whole writing this book and doing this deep dive, you've come from the game journalism side of this. How is doing this different than what you were doing before? And also, what do you think? That you go out and walk right back out there. There's all kinds of video game books now. What's the future of this stuff?
Yeah, totally. I actually like it a lot more, right? It's also way harder. I think my original article on Dave was 5,000 words, and it was a stretch to get it there, right? I'd never written anything that long before, because it's 5,000 edited words, which means you probably wrote way more than that and cut it all out to make it tight. And this was almost 70,000. So it was very long, very hard, and you want to make sure that everything is important, right? Like you don't have to make it super tight and punchy. There's a lot of sort of side stories in there that about the game and sort of its influence it's had on the industry. But collecting all that information and making it important to everyone who might read it, or at least relatable, is really hard, but way more rewarding than just putting an article out there. I think it's something I'm already working on more books. I know you're working on books. Trying to figure out how to continue to do this stuff because there is so much that's just totally untold out there, right? I know you can look up some of the most famous gaming companies with the word history after it on Google, and there's just nothing other than their company about page, and they can be so impactful to the industry, and that's pretty wild to me. So I want to continue to do more stuff like this, trying to figure out how to tell the stories that really matter and don't let pieces of gaming history fall away. And so part of that is also like an immense pressure to make sure that the thing that you write does it justice. And so I think hopefully I did that and can continue to do that. And my hope is that a lot of the publishers out there start to play along with it, right? And know how important it is to the industry as it develops.
Yeah, totally. No, that's awesome. And and I think at the end of the day, I mean, I would say like this to me in some ways you're exploring the creative process through the lens of this one game.
Absolutely.
And I think that's fascinating, whether you're, obviously everybody's in this room, we have some interest in video games, but I think, anybody can pick it up. If you're a creative person or you are interested in the creative process, I think this is a real deep dive, and it borders on, it's a serious commitment to this creative process, bordering on obsession, and I think that's something that everybody can relate to in some way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he talked about the fact that he just had to do it, right? Like he couldn't stop despite the effect that it was having on him. And I think part of that is, it, like you said, relates to any piece of art and is super interesting about what creating something can put its creator through, and does the end justify the means. I think all of that is super interesting.
That's good stuff. Are there any creative lessons for you, like, looking at the book that way?
Oh, wow. I don't know, it was definitely very challenging for me to write something like this. I mean, I think you look at putting together that many words and making it all useful is super challenging. I think I learned a lot about business through some of the lessons in Atari, right? Sort of like you said, fastest growing company in the US to bankruptcy pretty quickly, which is of their own volition. I think there was a lot there about innovating and always out-innovating yourself. Nolan has a great quote in the book where if you have competitors, it's already too late, right? Like you have to be your own competitor. You have to continue to be innovating so fast that by the time people notice, it's too late for them. And by the time they do notice, it's too late for you,
awesome.
Which was really interesting.
Yeah, that's super cool. That's awesome. Well, you want to take some questions?
Yeah, totally. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Alex, so I haven't read the book yet, so I will though. What's one of the most interesting things you've learned speaking to all these people involved in this game about Atari? Because you've written a long time in this industry already, that you have never contemplated, never heard, that was a real surprise to you.
It's a great question. I mean, I think to me it was just kind of a surprise that everyone experienced things differently, right? Like we hear about Atari and think that everyone in that culture, everyone at the company sort of experienced the culture the same way. But we hear about people smoking weed and doing whatever at their desks, having it more of a party culture, right? But Dave wasn't necessarily like that, right? He was a very serious guy. He experienced it differently than everyone else, and I thought that was pretty unique. And so I'd say that's probably one.
That's really interesting.
Thank you. Yep.
So you mentioned earlier that you wanted to kind of do this and get the history on other companies. What's your top three? Why?
Spoilers. Oh,
yeah, that's a great question. There's some that I shouldn't say because I'm trying to do it right now. And as Tim, I'm sure knows, one of the biggest issues with sort of digging up old dirt in history on a lot of these companies is sort of they get really scared. So the second that you find something or you alert them to that presence, they lock it down. So I won't get too much into it, but I do think that one really cool area to explore would be sort of educating the next generation on people who up until now have had the biggest impact on it. I think for a lot of people, I mean, we were pretty surprised. We were at the ground control booth where I'm doing a signing after this, and a mom came and picked up the book and showed it to like her, who must have been 4-year-old kid, right? Saying, oh, you should remember this, you should look at this. And I think before that, before books like this, they would never even know about people who had a huge impact on the industry. So I think that's probably an area I would focus on, but I shouldn't name specific names. Thank you, though. Yes.
Were there any stories or like anecdotes that you weren't able to include in the book because they were a little too tangential? And like, if there are, what were your favorites?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the Atari stuff specifically was a little tangential, but was really fun to get into. So someone like Al Alcorn had just great stories about back in the day of how they would actually, how they worked through a lot of it, right? So much of what they talked about is sort of repeating what's already out there. They've given the same interviews a lot, and so some of that was challenging them on that. But I'd say I think I got most of the good information in there and didn't leave too much on the cutting room floor. Yep.
Just a quick comment that I'd hope you'll comment on about that game and some other classic games is controller. And if you've ever played arcade missile command, you have that big trackball. And it's a very physical experience, and it's somewhat exhausting if you play it for a long time. So that's what contributes to that overall sort of fatigue of just constantly defending this thing, which doesn't translate to any of the other home versions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think playing the arcade version in general is the most stimulating experience of all of them, because it also is the most precise, right? So I think a lot of times when you play the home versions of the game, it can be really easy for it to just be like a fun experience, but you try so hard and are so trying to get the best score possible in a really real way on the arcade version. I think that is always sort of the best way, and that's a really interesting point about how it can contribute to that.
Now, pro tip, I think Al at the Atari Age booth actually have a hacked version of the Atari 2600 that is built for the Atari 2600 trackball controller. So go over there and buy one, it's awesome.
It's really cool.
It's definitely an upgrade to the joystick version.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I had just begun the book, but I'm curious, what was your correspondence with Dave like? Was it primarily email, or did you actually do some in-person?
Yeah, so it was a mix of email and phone. Dave is, like I said, sort of very reclusive about this. He barely liked talking about it. We do have a somewhat open lunch set up sometime in the future, but knowing Dave, it probably won't happen. He's a guy who you email and then you just don't hear back from a really long time, and you have to send sort of a couple emails to get things going. And so that's what we did at first. I sent some questions via email just to sort of let him know the areas that I was thinking of, let him know that it was a good book, it was saying nice things about him, and then his answers weren't very good, so we hopped on the phone and chatted through them, and that's when I think I got a lot more out of him. So the phone stuff was really good, and I think we had a couple multi-hour-long calls, sort of getting through it and talking through all of the questions and stuff that I heard from everyone else. And then my hope would be in the near future I can sort of talk to him again and get an additional update out there. Because I think for him it'll probably be really interesting too, as someone who knew people played the game but didn't think it was super important or impactful, to see how people react to the book.
So has he read the book yet?
He hasn't. I've been emailing him a lot. This is a great example about getting his address to send him copies of the book. And he has been pretty AWOL on it, and then said, oh yeah, someone pointed it out to me, so I pre-ordered the Kindle copy, and I'm looking forward to reading it, I was like, I'll send you a lot of books, we'll make it work. So he hasn't read it yet, but that was a great question.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Dave, actually a question for you. So we've all been buying your book and the poster set and all of that. What are we going to be looking at next?
Oh, he wouldn't tell you, but maybe I'll tell you what the next one is. Okay, fine. And then I don't want to steal his thunder. Working on a Pac-Man history book. So the history of Pac-Man. So tell your friends. Tell your friends. Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Alex, and thank you guys for joining us in this conversation. And let's give him a round of applause.
If you don't have the book, or you do have the book with you, I'm doing a signing at the ground control booth right after this. I'll have some cool enamel pins I have 4 pins made, custom designed around missile command that I think are pretty cool. So if you guys want to come by, you can. I'll be there from 6:30 to 7:30, and we can chat. Thank you everyone for
Great
coming.
book.